Thank you for joining us for this sermon podcast from United Church on the Green, located in New Haven, Connecticut. No matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are invited and welcome. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to learn more about our open and affirming ministry at United Church on the Green, please visit our website at unitednewhaven.org. Thank you.
Our reading from the scripture this morning is brief, but very important. So please listen as I read from Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 and 44. You have heard that it was said, "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. God is still speaking to us. Let us be open to listen, learn, and share.
On one very cold and very cloudy Saturday morning, January 15th, 1929, just 3 months after the beginning of the worst economic depression in the history of the United States, Martin Luther King Jr. was born, and he would grow up to be one of the most famous people in all of American history. He would, in his lifetime, change the very way that people understood democracy, religion, race, and understanding of the world, and all the things in between, throughout the entire world. He grew up in a relatively middle-class home in a very segregated Atlanta, Georgia. And though he never wanted for food or clothing, he knew that whenever he walked out of his door into some white America, he would always be considered colored, and therefore always second class. Here are some of his own reflections on what it was like to grow up in a segregated world.
King wrote in Growing Up Negro that growing up Negro in America is not a comfortable existence. It means being a part of the company of the bruised, the battered, the scarred, and the defeated. Being a Negro in America means trying to smile when you want to cry. It means trying to hold on to physical life amid psychological death. It means the pain of watching your own children grow up with clouds of inferiority in their mental skies. It means having your legs cut off and being condemned for being a cripple. It means seeing your mother and father spiritually murdered by the slings and arrows of daily exploitation, and then being hated for being an orphan. Being a Negro in America means listening to suburban politicians talk eloquently against open housing while arguing in the same breath that they are not racist. It means being harried by day and haunted by night by a nagging sense of nobodiness, and constantly fighting to be saved from the poison of bitterness. It means the ache and anguish of living in so many situations where hopes unborn have died. When he graduated from high school, he went on to Morehouse College in Atlanta, then Crozier Seminary in Pennsylvania. There he made straight A's and received a scholarship to go on to graduate school at Boston University School of Theology, where he again made straight A's and earned a PhD in theology. In Boston, he met a young woman named Coretta Christine Scott, who was a graduate student at the New England Conservatory of Music. They were married in 1953.
In January of 1954, King was invited to come to Montgomery, Alabama to interview for pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, which would become his first full-time pastorate. May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court in Brown versus the Board of Education ruled that segregation of public schools was unconstitutional. And on December 1st, as he was making plans for a series of sermons on the coming of the Christ child at Christmas, a black seamstress in Montgomery named Rosa Parks, after a long day at work, refused to give up her seat to a white man on a bus. The bus driver called the police. Police came and arrested her, and the town exploded. Montgomery was one of the most racially divided cities in the South in those days. Blacks were wanting to riot, and whites were wanting to kill blacks who were wanting to riot. The black community elected this young father, young preacher, young seminary graduate, Martin Luther King Jr., to organize them to respond to the crisis. Over 2,000 people rallied in front of a church that night to decide what they would do. The air was tense and explosive. It was a dangerous night for both blacks and whites. Reverend Martin Luther King stood up to speak to them that night, and here are some of the words he said.
And King spoke in the bus boycott speech. We are here this evening for serious business. We are here in a general sense because first and foremost, we are American citizens, and we are determined to acquire our citizenship to the fullness of its meaning. We are here also because of our deep-seated belief that democracy, transformed from thin paper to thick action, is the greatest form of government on earth. In our protest, there will be no cross burnings. No white person will be taken from his home by a hooded Negro mob and brutally murdered. There will be no threats and intimidation. We will be guided by the highest principles of law and order, the deepest principles of our Christian faith. Love must be our regulating ideal. If we fail to do this, our protest will end up as a meaningless drama on the stage of history, and its memory will be shrouded in the ugly garments of shame. In spite of the mistreatment that we have confronted, we must not become bitter and end up by hating our white brothers. Let no people pull you down so low as to make you hate them.
Instead of a riot, they organized a boycott of the Montgomery buses, with carpools taking people to work. Non-violently, they brought the city to its knees. The city took them to court arguing for segregation all the way to the Supreme Court. Finally, after over a year of attacks and threats and thousands of daily hate letters and phone calls, after his home was bombed and the police refused to investigate, and after King himself was arrested, after all this and more, the Supreme Court declared the segregation of public transportation facilities was unconstitutional. King and his movement became internationally famous. Together with Ralph Abernathy and others, they founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and began organizing voter registration throughout the South. At that time, less than 10% of blacks in America were registered to vote, and in most cases in the South, they were not allowed to register.
The reputation of Martin Luther King Jr. and the movement grew larger and larger through the early 60s. There were more sit-ins, there were more boycotts, there were more protests, all slowly tearing down the most visible excesses of the walls of oppression and discrimination in America. Through it all, King began to increasingly see that the struggle was no longer just for civil rights, but that it had become a movement for human rights. For when one part of humanity is held down, and oppressed, then all of humanity is harmed and made less because of it. But perhaps the turning point of his life and the life of the movement took place in 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham was arguably the most oppressive and thoroughly segregated city in the nation those days. The police commissioner of Birmingham was Eugene Connor, known as Bull Connor in the area. He was an angry, forceful racist who openly bragged about how many blacks he had beaten and killed in his lifetime. He promised that blood would run in the streets before Birmingham would desegregate its public facilities. On April 3rd, 1963, the protest of Birmingham began with boycotts, lunch counter sit-ins, and daily marches, all done quietly and calmly, completely non-violently. Bull Connor began arresting protesters, but hundreds more came. Over the weeks, the Birmingham jail had over 3,000 people in it, and yet more still came. King himself was one of those arrested early in the marches. Ironically, he was taken to jail on April 13th, Good Friday, 100 years to the day from when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. King spent the next 10 days running the campaign from the Birmingham jail. While there, he wrote the Letter from Birmingham Jail, which has become one of the most famous statements about nonviolent civil disobedience written in the 20th century. And here is a portion of what he said.
My dear fellow clergymen, while confined here in Birmingham jail, I came across your recent statement calling my present activities unwise and untimely. Since I feel that you are a man of genuine goodwill and that your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I want to try to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. You told us that our protests were untimely and that we should trust you and wait. For centuries, the Negro has heard wait, and wait has nearly always meant never. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. Perhaps it's easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you've seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will, drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen kick and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers and sisters smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on TV. When you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you. When you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored. When your first name begins with nigger and your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, and your wife and mother are never given the respected title of Mrs. When you are harried day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentments. When you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobody, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait.
Outside, Bull Connor seemed intent on proving that racism could be even more evil than King himself had described in his letter. He had firemen turn hoses on the marchers, which sent columns of water crashing into children and adults, knocking them down, ripping their clothing, smashing them against the side of buildings, sweeping them off the streets, bloodying their bodies, and throwing them into parks and alleys. Then he let loose German shepherd dogs trained to attack and bite and tear at running people. Day after day, television cameras showed a shocked world the horrors. But day after day, the carnage continued. And day after day, the marchers continued marching for freedom. The turning point occurred on Sunday, May 5th, 1963, when 3,000 children went on a prayer vigil to the Birmingham jail, where King and others were being held. When they arrived, the police threatened them and screamed at them, but all they did was kneel in prayer. Finally, one of the protesters stood up from his prayer and said to them, "We're not turning back. We haven't done anything wrong. All we want is our freedom. How do you feel doing these things?" Bull Connor yelled at his men to turn on the hoses, but nobody moved. The children continued praying. His men were silent. He yelled again, but they dropped their hoses. One of the firemen began crying. "We can't continue to do this," one of them said. The children continued silently praying. Nobody spoke again, and nobody got hurt. That event was the moral turning point of the struggle. Soon after that, the businesses of Birmingham finally agreed to integrate.
The next few years were a whirlwind. In the space of just 1 year, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in Birmingham was unconstitutional. Martin Luther King was invited to have an audience with Pope Paul VI at the Vatican, and he led a successful 125,000-person Walk for Freedom in Detroit. He received the Nobel Prize for Peace. He was named Time Magazine's Man of the Year. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and on August 28, 1963, he took part in the largest civil rights demonstration in history in Washington, D.C. At that march, King was the major speaker and gave one of the most powerful and lasting statements in his life on his philosophy and hopes and his dreams for all of America. Hear these words from King's I Have a Dream speech, given on August 28, 1963, from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C.
I say to you today, my friends, even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
I have a dream that one day, on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood.
I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi A state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day, right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls and walk together as sisters and brothers.
I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plains, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together.
This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. This faith we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jagged discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.
And this will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring.
And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So, let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California.
But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain, Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain, Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring.
And when this happens, and when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing the words of that Negro spiritual. Free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Truth shall make us free. Truth shall make us free. Truth shall make us free someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe. Truth shall make us free someday.
Over the next few years, the dream of King seemed to go bad. Protesters who promoted violence seemed to be on the rise, and people who promoted love and peace among all people seemed to be on the decline. Riots in Watts, Detroit, Newark, and other places seemed to undermine all that he had worked for. More and more of the momentum of the early civil rights movement seemed to be slipping away. Increasingly during this time, King was growing to believe that race is only one of the issues which was at the core of America's problems. Its violent nature and general disregard for poor people seemed to him to be the larger issues which stood over race. So in the summer of 1968, he planned to hold the biggest march on Washington ever. This time, the march would not be specifically about Black people or civil rights, but also about poverty. He called it the Poor People's Campaign. He was asked to come to Memphis, Tennessee to lend support to striking sanitation workers. He drove to the church that night, and without notes or manuscript or any idea of what he was about to say, he delivered one of the most stirring speeches of his life. He gave what has become known as the "I've been to the mountaintop" speech. These are some of the words that he said on April 3rd, 1968. He was assassinated the following day, April 4th.
Hear King's words, "I have been to the mountaintop." We have been forced to a point where we're going to have to grapple with the problems that people have been trying to grapple with through history. But the demands didn't force them to do it. Survival forces us to grapple with them. For years now, people have been talking about war and peace, but now no longer can they just talk about it. It is no longer a choice between violence and nonviolence in this world. It is nonviolence or non-existence. That's where we are today. And also in the human rights revolution, if something isn't done and in a hurry to bring the colored peoples of the world out of their long years of poverty, their long years of hurt and neglect, the whole world is doomed. Let us rise up tonight with a greater readiness. Let us stand with a greater determination. And let us move on in these powerful days, these days of challenge, to make America what it ought to be. We have an opportunity to make a better nation, and I want to thank God once more for allowing me to be here with you. I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't really matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop, and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned with that now. I just want to do God's will. And God has allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know that tonight, as we are people, we will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing anyone. Mine eyes have seen the glory, the coming of the Lord.
The next day, April 4th, 1968, King and Abernathy and several others spent most of the day planning for the big events of the next few days. He met with some of the organizers of the march and tried to streamline events so that they would not get out of hand. He met with a group of violent Black youths to see if he could talk them into laying down their clubs and rocks and working with him as nonviolent marshals of the march. They refused. He met with Andrew Young, who spent most of the day in court making arrangements so that the march would be considered a legal protest. At 6:05 that evening, Martin Luther King, Andrew Young, Jesse Jackson, and several others were standing on the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, waiting to go to dinner. The car that was to drive them pulled up. He recognized the driver as Ben Branch, the young man who was to sing for them after the dinner. He yelled down, "Ben," he said, "make sure you play Precious Lord, Take My Hand at the meeting tonight. Sing it real pretty." Ben yelled back, "Okay, Doc, I will." Just then, they heard the sound of a shot ringing out. The sound of a .30-06 high-powered rifle. King slammed backwards against the wall of the balcony and then fell forward onto the balcony floor. Ralph Abernathy rushed out to him. Someone else found a pillow to put under his head. A Secret Service agent held a towel to the wound in his neck to try to stop the bleeding. Others were running up the stairs. Some were running for cover. Some were screaming.
During the next few minutes, Ralph held the head of his dearest and closest friend in his lap while waiting for an ambulance. He was watching the life bleed out of him. His eyes seemed to be saying, "Ralph, it isn't over. It's only in other people's hands now. Don't give up. Never give up. Never give up. Never give up. Never give up." And then he died.
We shall